Hi there. I have to send the link to Nora, so I'll be right back.
Me, for whatever that's worth. When I was in college in West Virginia, yes, I was in West Virginia. That's supposed to be a joke, by the way, but I really was in West Virginia. And my roommate at the time happened to be African American and gay. And he was my best friend for 3 of my 4 years. And he ended up living with me in Sayville, where I grew up, for a summer. So he came out and he stayed with me for the summer. Very much into the theater, a very talented person. He's now an educator in Los Angeles. And the 2+ months that he stayed with me in Sayville, which I think, if you hyper generalize Long Island, you could probably reduce it to Sayville. And this is in the early 90s. I know I'm disclosing my age when I say that. It was the worst summer of my life because I saw it through his eyes. I would never have experienced or never have thought what somebody like my friend had to endure every day, wherever he was. And so every day, whether he went to 7-Eleven, whether he went to Grand Union at the time, whether he went to the movie theater by himself or with me, for 2+ months straight, I have seen discrimination to somebody I love very much, somebody I cared for, somebody I still am in touch with. At a very early age, in my late teens, early 20s. And when you see it that way, as opposed to, I'm saying as a white person, reading about it or maybe experiencing it second, third hand, but really living with it, but not being a part of it, but seeing somebody you care about go through it. In a place where you live that you never would think, because you're so blinded potentially by your upbringing, it really, really hit me in a way that I've never forgotten. And that's why the work we're about to embark on is so incredibly important, because there's so many other of my friends out there like that. And, another friend of mine who's a former superintendent, Arnie Dodge, who's crazy, by the way, and I will say that publicly, he calls this courageous conversations. We are going to have many courageous conversations, not just for the next few months, but for the next several years. And I'm really proud of us for doing this. I really am. And please know that this incredible board of education, those of us who are on this lead learning committee, those of you who want to be involved in some capacity, because I read some of the, the messages in the chat that want to be part of it, we'll have focus groups. So you will have the ability to have your voice heard in many ways. So I just want you to know that, if you're listening, if you're here at this moment, where you're watching this on a recording, you will have the ability to participate, not just again for the next few months, but for the next several years. I just wanted to share that.
Thank you. Many people said that raised their hand that they've read the book. Should we focus a little bit on cast? Is that because we had said I'm willing to take the conversation in any direction people want. It's sort of a relief to have a conversation like this on this committee. We can talk about cast. Shirley had sent out some questions to get the conversation going, or we could continue on this if somebody has a comment or wants to ask a question about the work, or what, we don't really have that much more about the work because it's kind of still in the process of being fleshed out. But Does anybody have a comment before we, I mean, talking about caste will really not take us too far from the conversation that we have started. Yes,
Hi, my name is Vess Gottlieb, and I'm originally from Maine, which is a predominantly white state, but it's also a very underserved and poor state. So when I hear white privilege, I recall back to when I was in school there, and some of the kids they came to school smelling bad because they didn't have showers, and there was a lot of underprivileged. So sometimes when you hear the term, for me personally, white privilege, not all white people are privileged. So it can, to be play devil's advocate here, it can be kind of like a slap in the face for those of us who grew up in a home maybe where we saw in the winter it was so cold you could see your breath indoors. So I just think that sometimes that people that are white that don't come from privilege are still looked at as having a privilege, and it's not okay to disregard that. And that's my comment.
thank you for sharing that. There is a reference to that in the article, and I just, the article that, we have read, that I don't know if you got a chance to read, but it says that, this is from Diversity in the Classroom and Understanding White Privilege. And it says, an encompassing definition of white privilege: having greater access to power and resources than people of color in the same situation. So I hear what you're saying, and I think that that is a common, not complaint, but concern about using the term white privilege, because it sounds as if it's assuming that everybody white has a certain kind of, like a leg up, or is born with a spoon in their mouth, or doesn't suffer, or isn't hungry. I mean, there's a lot of food insecurity and a lot of poverty among white people too. I think the privilege piece is when you're comparing people of the same economic disadvantage, really, in that case. Yes, go ahead. I'm sorry. Yes, Nicoletta.
Vas, thank you for saying that, because I was going to mention that as well. Like, just, we can't, I didn't grow up in a wealthy neighborhood. So to say that I'm privileged now, yes, I consider myself privileged because of where I live, and, I have a roof over my head, I have clothes on my back. Like I think, and it's not, I thank God for that. Like that's my daily mantra to myself, but that doesn't mean I started my life that way. So it's just something to be attuned to. We don't want to shut the door on people that aren't racist or don't believe in racism, and just automatically assume when we say white privilege. To tell you the truth, I assumed that it means, oh, you're white, that you're privileged, just right off the bat, without reading into it. And that's why I'm here, and that's why I read up on it. And it's important to just make that known. That's not what we're saying. It's a term, but it doesn't mean that everyone who's white is privileged. It can mean exactly what Nora was saying.
Well, it also has to do
Well-
with situations, I think, more than anything. And we were talking about respect before, because perfect example is a person who's white and could be a drug dealer or somebody who's arrested for drugs, and a Black person who is arrested for drugs, and the Black person will be treated
Differently.
not even differently, worse than a person who's white. And both of those people could be poor, both those people could be uneducated, from different, same areas of a town. But it's situations, and it's the lack of respect, and that the white person is given a second chance because they're white, or maybe they didn't mean it, or they're excused. So it's not always about an economic level in terms of what privilege means. It's more of somebody getting just really more of like it's an excuse for giving that person a second chance because they're white, as opposed to maybe an African American person, and that they're not given the same chances. And I think that is really what white privilege has to do more with.
When Dr. Hines referenced Courageous Conversations before, Glenn Singleton wrote a book, as he was referring to Courageous Conversations. And one of his key points on when we're talking about race is that you have to isolate race. And you have to isolate race as its own discussion, not talking about economics, not talking about gender. And so when we're talking about white privilege, we're not talking about privilege from an economic standpoint. We're talking about the fact that we live in a white dominant culture, either white dominant or white supremacist culture, that privileges the narrative of the white person and provides the white person power. And that, so when we're talking about the white privilege, it's that unconscious bias and understood narrative of the lived experience of a white person in our country versus a person who is not white. And so it's important that that is what is acknowledged, and that transcends to so many things. So without a doubt, if you are isolating race in our white dominant culture, a white person holds power and privilege over all other races in our country. And so, and it's important that, and one of the things I'm very thankful for, and Dr. Hines was speaking about it before, is that using the NYU Metro Center to come in as a point of experts and advocacy and education will allow and support in having these conversations, from educating and from navigating, because they will be difficult conversations, and because people have their lived experience that feel that they often don't have power or privilege, and being able to facilitate conversations where they might realize that not that they realize, that they will be exposed to why they have the power and privilege that they may not have realized before.
Thank you for that. Ness, did you want to say something else? You looked like you had your light off.
Well, after carefully listening, I understand what you're saying, but the other thing that I know with the teaching of critical theory, it also kind of spins it. So even if you're white and you say, I'm not racist, then they say, well, you don't know that you are, but you actually are racist. So that's where the danger for me as having a child in the school system, if they were taught, look, we've treated people horribly, and you get that in college all these years, and so you have to be ashamed of being white. And I'm very proud of my ancestors. I didn't grow up rich or anything like that, but I didn't see I see this as sometimes a push to turn it around to being like, even though you are accepting of other people and you're happy to interact and you're glad for other cultures in your life, that's you're still a racist. And I don't like that being pointed to our children, to be like, you have to see how being white is inherently racist. And that's the danger for me personally.
Mike.
All right, I have to skedaddle and put my kids to bed, but I want to say this before I leave. I think we're in the embryonic stages of having these conversations. And Bess, I appreciate you. First of all, I appreciate what you're wearing. That looks very warm. By the way,
Thanks.
I don't know if you got that from Maine or what, but I'm kind of digging it. Here's the way I view this. Now, I have colleagues, I have superintendent friends who are Asian American, they're African American, they're Hispanic, and they have the ultimate power in the school district, right? Think about this. I have friends who are 10 times smarter than I am, who are, from different races. And I see how the system treats them differently than me or my colleagues who are white. When I look at forget white privilege for a second. When I look at the structures that we have in place that are inherent in the way that we operate, whether it's within the schools or just within society, my African-American colleagues, I would say, if I had to put a metric on it, have it 10 times harder. It's 10 times harder for them to do something, to move something forward than I think it is for me or my Hispanic friends, my Latino friends, who are superintendents, who have doctorates, who have been doing this for years in different places on Long Island and or New York State. And that's all based on, I believe, the color of their skin or their background. And that gets to the heart of the matter. It's our biases and assumptions of who someone is based on their skin color and or their religion. This is where I think we are and will be operating from our upbringing to where we are right now to where we want to be. And we have to confront all those things. And so I think the message I want to share with you is, regardless of where we came from, regardless of where we are at this moment, we need to be collectively in a much different place. I believe here in Port Washington, not because it's a bad place, but because if we're looking at true equity and parity, then we will be confronting a lot of biases and assumptions that we don't even know that we have. We don't even know that it's part of our DNA. And that is going to be the most difficult thing, because we may say things and we don't even know we're saying them in a way that lands on people, that hurts them or makes them feel that we don't value them. And I think the books that we read, the articles that we read, the policies that we produce in the future need to reflect where we want to be in the future. That's all I want to say before I start singing the wheels to my kids before I put them down.
May I say something, Dr.
Please.
Hines? Excuse me, can you hear me?
Yeah, Renee, go ahead.
Okay. The article that Shirley circulated points out something that we should, about the conversations that we're going to have, which is they are
Everybody mute.
they're uncomfortable. And we should recognize that the first reaction people will have to the term white privilege is a bit of a defensive term. They will automatically have a defensive posture. Simply because, just because somebody says, well, the term exists, this is a phenomenon that exists, it doesn't mean that just because we're having a discussion about this, that everyone in the room who is white happens to be a racist. A racist, let's ask a basic question. Do you believe that there are different species amongst human beings? If you don't believe that, you're not a racist, because a race implies a different species. So let's just get that out of the way. If you can, one can affirm that, you know what, we acknowledge that there are different variations amongst human beings, like trees. There are different types of trees. There are different types of flowers, but they all belong to the species of trees and flowers. We can just move that uncomfortable barrier away, out of the way. You're not a racist. Race does not exist. It's a myth. So if we can acknowledge that. Now, if somebody says, no, I do believe that there are different subspecies, well, then that's a bit of a problem. But if somebody can affirm that, no, they're not, they don't, we all belong to the same thing. We all belong to the same, we have the same number of chromosomes, same blood types. The fact that My husband's mother came from Europe, and his husband and his father are descendants of people from Africa. The fact that those two people can get together and produce a child tells you there's no such thing as a race. They belong to the same species. Unfortunately, racism does exist. So if we can just get that out of the way and understand nobody in the room is a racist. But we are all actually victims of this lie. White privilege is something that has it has victimized everyone. We've been born into a system that was constructed long before our birth, and unfortunately, we all exist in it. The fact that we had a Capitol riot where the majority of the people that participated in it looked a certain way, and yet they confronted the police and attacked the police, and guns were not drawn. That's an example of that kind of privilege. Because we all know that if the mob looked a different way, it looked like different people, the reaction would have been different, very, very different. I found the article very, very enlightening. It talked about the fact that there are certain barriers. It refers to the fact that there's a certain treatment, there's an amount of safety belonging to a dominant group. There's a freedom from barriers, financial freedom, housing freedom, behavior with the police. And those barriers exist. The fact that we have students, they don't see many people that look like me in the district. As a matter of fact, I just talked to an assistant principal today about one particular student. It's a Black student that she's having a lot of trouble, and she's labeled automatically as a problem. Nobody knows her. A lot of people were not familiar. I know many of her teachers, I certainly wasn't, about her backstory. I had no idea that she had a 14-year-old brother that was killed last year, shot in senseless gun violence while visiting his father in Queens. I had no idea. I had no idea that she had experienced another death this October, that her aunt at 20 years old died. And the family's been dealing with this. You know, she opened up to me because I look like her. And certainly we have caring people in the district, we do. They do the best they can. But again, there's a certain privilege and a certain behavior, a certain posture that's given to certain students, a certain benefit of the doubt that's given. And there's some kids they're not given that.
You know, Renee,
Today was tough, I have to tell you. It was kind of tough today after having that conversation with that student. I taught in New York City, and every day I confronted that. And when I came to Port, I have to tell you, I really thought I got away from that. This pandemic has really brought all of that back. I'm sorry.
well, first of all, you have nothing to be sorry for. I applaud you for sharing very much. I spoke to one of your colleagues a couple months ago who have shared some very insightful things, which I could talk to you offline about some of the things that you bring up. You know, the only thing I can say is if more of our staff members like you open up like this during our focus groups with NYU, the qualitative and quantitative information that we receive will enable us to move forward in a positive direction. If people clam up and don't share, it would be the ultimate sin. And thank goodness you were there for that particular student, and I'm glad that you were there for her. But there are lots of stories like this, I'm afraid, you know, over the years. Elena, and then I need to go, unfortunately, but we need to have this conversation again soon, for sure.
I want to say very briefly, actually Nora mentioned that in the beginning sometime, because I have students from Queens and I have been teaching online since March, and half of my students at least, if not more, come from underprivileged backgrounds because they live in Queens, and a lot of them are first generation immigrants, again, from low income families, the African American, Latinos, I mean, literally from all over the world. And they have been so much more affected. And I know this from a research perspective, because now there are a lot of articles that show that African American community, Latino communities are much more disproportionately affected by the pandemic. But my personal students were affected by this pandemic so much more. And so I wanted to say that white privilege, why it sounds as if, you know, it encompasses people that it shouldn't. Actually, this is what it means, that institutionally, you have people who are disproportionately affected, negatively affected. And this isn't just a pandemic. This has happened traditionally with every single economic crisis, with Hurricane Katrina. You can read, you know, a lot about those events. A lot of these events affect low-income populations, African-American communities, Latino communities disproportionately. This is what white privilege means. It doesn't mean necessarily personally the individual, but as a society, I think a lot of what has happened has affected people in very adverse communities, neighborhoods, in very adverse ways.
Yeah, I would agree, Elena, that is very true. It is, and you absolutely do see it when a crisis occurs. When natural disasters occur, you see the disparate, I mean, look at the government response when the terrible storm had hit Puerto Rico. Look at the federal response there. They were treated as if they were told, people really put a hole in our budget, as if there were a problem. They didn't ask for the storm to hit them and knock out all of their power, but yet they were looked upon as a problem. However, when you have a tornado hit Kansas, Oklahoma, the federal response is very swift. Once again, you're right, Elena. If you look at the population, that's the reason why.
I mean, I remember personally the response to Katrina. I was devastated myself. I don't belong to those communities, but it was just devastating to see, what was happening. And I've done a lot of research on residential segregation and neighborhood inequality, and I can see this kind of the same events affecting the same populations adversely over and over and over again.
But unfortunately, it doesn't always take, you see it more vividly when a natural disaster occurs. It happens every day. If a Black woman goes to give birth in a hospital, she has a much higher rate, probability of dying in childbirth than a white woman.
Absolutely.
If you look at the number of evictions from the pandemic, the moratorium has protected a lot more people of European descent. The first people to be evicted are people of color. Once again, there's the privilege. Look at the number. The NPR just put out a report. It just came out yesterday. They did a very in-depth report about the history of policing and the treatment and how many men, young men of color, died just this past year. Once again, that is privilege. Why? Because when a police officer stops a person of European descent, they're much more likely, that person has the privilege, the ability to be able to argue with the police. Why are you're going to give me a ticket for this? A person of color cannot do that. They're silenced. Because if he reaches for his wallet, the police may feel threatened, and there is no recourse for that person. If you look at the sentence, a Black man is going to get 30 years for something where a white man may get 5. That's privilege. Why? Because the judge can identify more with the white defendant than the Black.
I mean, this goes all the way, from the top to the bottom. I want to share just one anecdote from graduate school, and this was a while back. We had an African-American professor. He was teaching in my department, and I still remember I was, fairly new. Again, this was a long time ago, so I wasn't even aware of all of these issues back then. But I still remember when he told us. And he lived in the suburbs. He lived in a very nice neighborhood. And he told us that twice he was approached by the police. One time he was just walking in his own neighborhood and police came to him. And again, he would always come, and that's what he wore, like like suits and tie and impeccably dressed. But the police would approach him and say, "What are you doing here? Who are you?" Ask him to identify himself. And then the second time he was driving in his car, getting from the university home. And again, he was stopped by the police asking him what he was doing there. So as a graduate student even, I was so struck by these two examples. And this continues to, again, reproduces itself at various levels in society.
This happened to Dr. Henry Louis Gates, if you
I was about to say that, yes.
Where you remember, Nora, this was when President Obama was in office, and
He was
returning home from a vacation.
Yep.
From a
In his
trip.
front door, yes.
Right. He wasn't attempting to enter his house from a window saying, "Oh, I might have left a window." He was entering through the front door.
Horrifying.
And a white neighbor called the police. There's a Black man. First of all, I don't understand how this woman could not have known all these years that he was her neighbor. It's bizarre. And she called the police. Here's another example, most recent example of white privilege. Do you remember the incident in Central Park?
With the phone call, with the bird, the guy who was looking at the
Exactly.
birds, a birder.
Right, white
dog.
privilege is, yes. He stepped out of his caste. If you read the book Caste, he
Yeah.
stepped out of his caste and dared to tell this woman,
Right.
please follow the rules, follow the law.
Right.
I'm going to call the police. Why? Because she understood that her privilege would allow her to be listened to by an authority, they would take her seriously and come,
Yeah,
thereby placing this man's life in danger
absolutely.
because of the past history of interactions of Black men being accused of raping and harassing and harming white women. She took advantage of that and used that history and her privilege, knowing the police would believe her. His life meant nothing.
The only good news about that is that she was not one who got away with that, because that has happened, I'm sure, thousands and thousands of times. But in this case, she was called out on it and then some, you know, but thank goodness he was
Safe.
Right?
Yeah, something
Probably traumatized, but safe. Yes. I'm gonna have to end this, and I have to say this has been for me, it's been a fantastic discussion and probably, you know, in the years that we've been doing diversity committee, the best meeting that we've had, and very, very authentic. And I think the beginning of more conversations. And I want to thank everybody who stayed on till 8:38. And Shirley, I don't know if you want to say a few words, my co-chair. You muted. Yeah.
No, I'm coming. I'd like to, hi Renee. I'd like to thank everybody for coming and participating. This obviously is sometimes not the easiest conversation to have, but again, it raises awareness. It gives us a different perspective. Vass, I'm glad you brought up the point about white privilege, and also Nicoletta, because that is kind of a viewpoint that some people can have.
Yeah.
I don't feel that that's what white privilege means, but it can be interpreted like that. You know, the real meaning is, you know, when a Black man is stopped, and I have friends where they have to put their hands on the wheel when the cop comes up to the window and say, "Officer, I don't have a gun, I have no weapon." Whereas a white man, he might just come up to the window and say, "Oh, here's your license and registration."
Yeah.
You know, we hear these stories a lot of
Orlando
So,
Castro tried that and got killed.
right. I feel it's a good conversation that we've had. I appreciate everyone's viewpoint because it's very important. That's how we learn from each other and grow together as a team, and everyone's opinions are important, even if they're different, or because we're all learning. And Renee, I appreciate also what you did. And, you know, I hope we can continue this conversation because it really is, it's important.
Okay, we'll let you know when the next meeting is. And thanks again. This was.
Dr. Vasilnayev, it was a pleasure talking with you. It really
Thank you.
was.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Yes, nice meeting you.
You too. Thank you for
See
having
you,
me.
Renee, I haven't seen you in a long time. It's really good
It's
to
so
see
good.
you.
I truly
Can I
look
say
forward
one
to
thing?
meeting in person.
Sure. I can't see who wants to talk, but please do.
Oh, if you would like to be, because some of you are not on my mailing list, like I have a diversity mailing list, which is where like I sent out the white privilege article. So if I send out an article, but you're not on my mailing list, and you just go to the Zoom link on the calendar, you won't get the article to get ahead of time to participate. So if you'd like to be on my mailing list, I'm gonna put my email address over here. And if you could just email me and say, "Hi, I'm so-and-so. I would like to be on the diversity committee mailing list." And I send out the Zoom link, I send out the connection, you know, the articles that we're reading. I say, you know, we did the book survey. That's how we're ending up reading Caste. And if you'd like to participate in the book chat, we were supposed to have a book chat tonight, but we kind of ran out of room. But please email me and I will add you to the list because it's easier. Like I think Vess had a little, you know, issue. I didn't feel she had the password. So if you're on my list, I'm checking it twice, gonna find out who's naughty and nice. You will be on my list and you'll get everything directly in the article, okay? So please email me. We love to have you. I love to see new faces. And Nora, I'm sorry I cut you off. I apologize. Anyone else want to talk? Go ahead.
No, I asked you to speak.
Oh, okay. I don't have my hearing aids on, so I couldn't hear you very
I have
well.
mine, so I knew when. Okay, good night, everybody, and we'll let you know when the next meeting is. And again, thank you. Thank you, thank you.
Yeah, good night.
Bye.
Everyone,
Good
take
night, thank you.
Thank you. Good night.